Fellow residents, friends, we're going to get started. But before I introduce the speaker, I hold this up, and you know what it means. If you've got one, please turn it off, or at least quiet it. And we're also, maybe for some of our newcomers, if you ask a question, you need one of these. And we'll bring it to you. So, our speaker has become, over the years, a really good friend. She's been a speaker at Saturday Morning Live for the first time. And her first time deals with the upper level of the slide here. Now the story continues, and that second line is part of the story. It's great to have you back again at Goodwin House, please.
Thank you, John. And good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. Some of these slides might be a bit busy, so I will be reading a few of them aloud so the people who can't quite see them can catch the small print when that comes up. And as John said, you'll notice I've called today's talk Military Women Getting There, Military Women Staying There, with a question mark. When I was last at Saturday Morning Live in July 2023, I spoke of how legal and policy restraints, usually based in cultural practices and assumptions about women's physical, mental, and emotional sturdiness, had limited their military roles, and how, over the 115 years, often because of national need, women slow step by slow step had proven their ability to perform well in all military roles, including ground combat, and were at last serving in all these roles. But alas, today I'm back, this time to speak about whether that will continue to be the case, or if new policies may soon re-limit and restrain military women's eligibility to serve in ground combat and also in senior leadership roles, despite their success over the past 20 years. And as I'll make clear this morning, after each advance military women have made, they have generally encountered a resurrection of the very cultural and often emotionally based assumptions that they had just surmounted in actual practice by those who simply can't or won't accept that they can really do the job. Such assumptions and emotions are on the march again. But this time, instead of various assorted writers or talking heads, it's our Secretary of Defense, or War if you'd rather, who is leading the parade. Here are some of the accusations he is leveling against military women. The first accusation is that the last administration's woke diversity, equity, and inclusion program placed women, men of color, and certain woke white men, none of whom merited such assignments, into some of the most senior and visible leadership positions in our military, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So a number of these 3- and 4-star generals and admirals were removed from these positions without explanation. Among those removed were several women, including the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of Naval Reserve, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, the U.S. representative to the NATO Military Committee, the Superintendent of the Naval Academy, and the Director of the Defense Health Agency, and also the Senior Air Force Assistant to the Secretary of Defense himself. The second accusation, as the Secretary of Defense insisted in his book, The War Against Warriors, and has repeated the same accusations since, is that the standards are lowered for women so that they could enter ground combat occupations and senior leadership assignments to meet DEI quotas, thereby reducing our readiness, lethality, and combat unit bonding. All I can say to that is hogwash. There have been a lot of ceilings on women's participation in military occupations and admissions to schools, such as the service academies, over the years, but I cannot think of any instance of quotas set to wedge women into jobs for which they were not qualified. In fact, since 1994, as aviation and naval warfare were open to women, Congress has required that the services each develop and maintain gender-neutral occupational standards for every single military job. I'm sure someone along the way has explained this to the Secretary of Defense, but apparently he didn't believe it. And with that as background, I'm going to begin today's talk with a condensed recap of the history of women in the US military. So, I gotta find my clicker. Sorry. Let's begin with a look at the numbers. According to the Defense Management Data Center, at the end of fiscal year 2025, about 18.1% of those on active duty were women. But they are not evenly spread across the services. As you can see, the Air Force and the Navy are at least 20% women. Space Force has about 19.2%. The Army is around 16.6%, while the Marines are at 10%. The latest numbers I have for the Coast Guard, part of the Department of Homeland Security, are 14.5% women, and that's from 2018. It's hard to get these numbers today. They've been removed from most of the websites that the military runs, and most of the numbers published today are all inclusive. Everybody's in the number. It's not broken out demographically by ethnicity or gender or whatever else anymore. And women also, by the way, comprise similar or greater percentages of the reserves and the Air and National Guard. As of today, all military occupations and military units are still open to women. There have been women on or near the battlefield in all America's wars since at least the American Revolution. Those of you who watched Ken Burns's The American Revolution on PBS may recall Margaret Corbin. She fought in the Battle of Fort Washington during the Revolution, where she took over her fallen husband's cannon and was later wounded herself. She was the first woman awarded a disability pension by Congress for wounds incurred in combat. So this has a long, long history. During the Civil War, it's estimated that about 400 women disguised themselves as men to fight on one side or the other. Among other women who served then was Dr. Mary Walker, a surgeon, the only woman ever awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, though she was a civilian. The Army contracted her to serve as a surgeon, and she frequently attended the wounded on the battlefield. She was captured by the Confederate Army and spent 4 months as a POW. Upon her release, she returned back to the battlefield, still performing as a surgeon. Perhaps the most famous woman to serve was formerly enslaved Harriet Tubman, who was a forerunner of Special Forces operators. She served as a scout and a spy for the Army of the North and as a battlefield nurse, but she never received either pay or pension for her service. About 4,200 women did receive pay and because they were recruited to serve as nurses with the Army of the North, although they did keep their civilian status. Among them were a number of Black women and some immigrant Irish nuns who served as nurses aboard Navy ships. first nuns aboard ship. In the Spanish-American War, about 1,500 nurses, all women who maintained their civilian status, were recruited to serve with the Army. These women were so successful in saving lives during the typhoid epidemics that swept through the Army camps that the Army Nurse Corps was established by the Army Reorganization Act of 1901. The Navy followed suit when Congress established the Navy Nurse Corps through the Naval Appropriations Act of 1908, but only after a very lively debate on whether women needed too much furniture for daily military life. It's right in the congressional record if you ever. Only women were allowed in the Nurse Corps, and they were vital to our efforts in World War I and World War II. Over 22,000 women served in the Army or Navy Nurse Corps during World War I. Several of them were wounded while deployed near battlefields. In World War II, over 71,000 women served in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, and there was legislation wending its way through Congress at the time the war ended to draft women into the military to serve as nurses. It never happened because the war ended, but women can be drafted. 16 of these nurses died from enemy fire, including on the beach at Anzio, and 78 were prisoners of war. All but one were held by Japan. Beyond the nurses, during World War I, the Navy and Marine Corps both recruited women, including some black women, to serve on active duty. The Navy had about 12,500 women, nicknamed yeomanettes, who served mostly stateside in clerical roles. The Marine Corps had about 300 women. The Army did not recruit women, but they hired about 200 bilingual, in English and French, telephone operators, nicknamed Hello Girls, who served overseas with the Expeditionary Forces. And Congress granted these Hello Girls veteran status in 1977. At the end of the war, all these women went home. And this one I'm going to read from here. World War II, all services recruited women, and about 400,000 served during the war in a wide variety of non-combat roles. In other countries, Russia, for instance, women served in combat because they were running out of men. Over 1,000 civilian women pilots served in non-combat, yet often dangerous roles as women Air Force service pilots. They were given veteran status also in 1977. And again, most women were discharged at the end of the war. As you can see from the first few slides, there have always been women involved in fighting our nation's wars. And when we needed them in our early history, we didn't hesitate to find civilian women to work with the military. Then, in World War I, some services actually enlisted women, and during World War II, all services recruited them as both enlisted troops and officers. But the national expectation was that as soon as the emergency was over, these women would return to what was considered women's usual roles in society. And so they did. But pay particular attention to the last two bullets in this slide. These are sentiments that continue today. There was always some fussing in Congress, among some servicemen and within the public, that women would weaken the military. And the jobs women entered weren't determined by merit, but what society considered seemly occupations for women. By 1948, the situation in Europe was such that congressional leaders and some high-ranking military officers, such as General Eisenhower, concluded that beyond the Nurse Corps, the services needed to maintain a small cadre of women in the active peacetime forces. This was due to concerns that we might soon have to go to war against the Soviet Union. This led to the passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. It allowed women to serve in the peacetime active duty forces, but under extremely limited conditions. Among the concerns expressed during the congressional hearings surrounding this law was the usual fear that women would soften the military, reduce readiness and lethality. Hence, provisions that limited women's numbers and seniority and kept women off most ships and out of military aircraft were part of the bill. And after a long discussion on how lazy men might deliberately marry servicewomen to support them, provisions precluding women from drawing dependence benefits such as health care and married housing allowances were added, with a proviso that women could draw these allowances only after proving that their husbands were unable to support themselves due to mental or physical disability. You may have noticed that the law says nothing about women in ground combat. Despite the fears of softening the force, the mere idea that anyone would ever consider assigning women to ground combat seemed so absurd that Congress saw no need to mention it in this legislation. There were also executive orders and service policies issued around this law that reflected the cultural expectations of women in 1948. Hence, the discharge of those who became pregnant or who lived in a household where a child under 18 spent more than 30 days per year. For instance, if a widowed or divorced man with a 17-year-old who came for a month in the summer visited that household, she had to get out of the military in those days. Men did have to salute higher-ranking women officers, although there was talk about not requiring this in the congressional hearings. And women could have men working for them, but all the services had policies barring women from having command authority over men. That means the ability to award non-judicial punishment to men or to order them to be court-martialed. This prohibition was believed necessary because too many men, it was thought, would resent having women with that sort of authority. This policy effectively kept women from serving in virtually all military command positions. But there was one thing on the bright side. Military women did receive equal pay with the men who had the same rank and length of service, and that was an astonishing rarity in 1948. Since the end of World War II, the culturally condoned roles for women have grown exponentially. The huge transition we've undergone in acceptable roles for women can be clearly seen by looking at the transformation of women's roles in the military between 1948 and now. In 1948, their numbers were few, their ranks junior, their occupations limited. In March 2026, at least for right now, women can serve in any military occupation or unit for which they meet the requirements, the standards. But the journey has been fraught. Almost every time a change opening more military assignments to women was announced, there was a backlash by loud voices insisting that women were weakening our national security for a silly social experiment. It happened in 1948. It happened in the 1970s when the service academies were open to women. It happened in the 90s when combat aviation and Navy combatant ships were open to women. And as we'll see, it's still happening today. Oh, and by the way, culturally acceptable roles for men also changed a bit during this time frame, causing the Army and Air Force to open their Nurse Corps to men in the mid-50s. The Navy waited until the mid-60s to allow men into its Nurse Corps. On June 12th of this year, will mark the 7 78th anniversary of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. And it's taken most of those years to slowly dismantle, step by careful step, the barriers to women's military participation deliberately built into that act. And here's something, just a reminder, some things from that time frame. There was a 2% limitation on women's numbers, caps on women's promotions, and they had been limited above the ranks of Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps captain or Navy lieutenant. And only 2 were allowed to be colonels or captains, and they were temporarily that. The head of the Nurse Corps and the head of the women's branch of the military. And there were no admirals or generals allowed. Until 1967. And the day all those things were changed by a law signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, Public Law 90-130, 130. After Johnson signed that law, the headline for the lead story in the then women's pages of the Washington Post read, "You may soon have to call the general ma'am." Well, it wasn't all that soon. It happened in 1970 when Anna Mae Hayes, head of the Army Nurse Corps, and Elizabeth Hoisington, the head of the Women's Army Corps, were both nominated for Brigadier General and subsequently promoted. The major cultural transformations of the 60s and 70s brought great changes to American society. Here are 4 in particular that changed major rules for military women. First, and probably the most important, 1960, oral contraception was approved. In the late 70s, the women's liberation movement began. In 1972, and this was another real changer for military women, draft authorization expired. The Selective Service continues today, which registers men only, but there has been no draft for over 50 years. And in 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and they were approaching the number of states that was required to make it part of the Constitution. So let's take a look at the sweeping changes of the 70s that continued into the 80s and that could not have taken place without parallel changes in American society. So for women in the military, ROTC was open to them in 1971, and the Navy followed suit. The Air Force began to allow pregnant women and women who had a child in the household to request authorization to remain on active duty, and the Army and Navy followed. The Supreme Court decision in Frontiero versus Richardson struck down differences with respect to military benefits for men and women. It was argued, as some of you know, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was at the ACLU at the time. She argued that case before the Supreme Court. 1973, the Navy opened non-combat aircraft to women, and the Army and Air Force followed suit. The Marine Corps did not open aviation to women until 1994. The Coast Guard began recruiting women. The Coast Guard, between 1948 and 1973, had no women because they were left out of the 1948 legislation. In 1976, Congress opened the 3 service academies to women, and I'll have more to say about that. In 1978, the District Court for the District of Columbia in Owens v. Brown ruled that excluding women from all Navy ships is unconstitutional. They should only be excluded from the combatant ships. Like they could be on oilers and repair ships and supply ships and that sort of thing. And the Defense Authorization Act of 1979 authorized the Navy to assign women to non-combatant ships, and the Navy opened the surface warfare, diving, and salvage occupations to women at that time. Now, as I said, many of these changes were readily embraced by military leaders, but that leadership strongly opposed the opening of the service academies to women. During the congressional hearings, the service chiefs testified against allowing women to attend the academies, since women were barred from combat occupations and units then. And as in 1948, they feared the standards at the academies would be reduced to accommodate women, which would lessen readiness. Academy students also testified at the hearings as well. And one of the high-ranking first-classmen from West Point told Congress that women should not attend the academies because the academies are ours. Congress, however, in a bipartisan vote, opened the academies to women because at that time it seemed likely that the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution would be passed by the necessary number of states, which would have forced the academies to open anyway. And because not all men, and the second reason was that because not all men commissioned through the service academies ended up serving in combat occupations, especially in the Air Force. Women in those early service academy classes faced a lot of blowback, heavy blowback, and resentment. James Webb, a decorated Marine who suffered injuries during the Vietnam War that were severe enough that he was medically retired, and who later became Secretary of the Navy, a US Senator, and a successful author, taught at the Naval Academy in the late 70s. During that time, he published a strongly written, passionate article for Washingtonian magazine, which I believe is still passed around at the Naval Academy, called "Women Can't Fight," to express his deep disapproval of the opening of the academies to women. And keep in mind, he was on the staff of the Naval Academy and teaching some of these women at that time. The Gulf War of 90 and 91 helped bring about the end of the remaining provisions of the 1948 legislation. 40,782 women were deployed to the theater of war. 15 were killed and 2 taken as POWs. The successful deployment of thousands of women to a theater of war and their service there during the Gulf War, on the ground as aviators aboard non-combat aircraft and aboard non-combat ships, led Congress in the aftermath of the war to lift the remaining 2 legal barriers to women's military service passed in the 1948 legislation. Combat aviation assignments and assignments aboard most Navy combat ships were open to women by the National Defense Authorization Acts of 1992 and 93. Service aboard Navy submarines remained closed to women until 2010 because of privacy considerations. Ground combat occupations, such as infantry and special forces, remained closed by policy, but many additional Army and Marine Corps occupations and units were open to women in those services after the Gulf War. And the Marine Corps, as I mentioned earlier, finally opened aviation to women in 1994. However, as with the opening of the service academies, there was a lot of blowback, particularly with respect to carrier aviation. The Navy's carrier aviation community was reeling from the recent tailhook scandal and its aftermath. Many aviators believed that certain members of Congress voted in favor of opening combat naval aviation to punish naval aviators for tailhook. And many of these young aviators believed their senior leaders had failed them, and I agree with them on that. It took the Navy years to recover from the effects of tailhook, and the integration of Navy women into combat aviation was difficult in some units. And as I said before also, at the same time as these new jobs were open to women, Congress passed legislation requiring that each service establish and enforce gender-neutral occupational standards for all naval and aviation occupations and units. And of course, the opening of aviation and naval warfare also brought forth a harvest of books and articles on why women should not fight. Two of them, The Kinder, Gentler Military by Stephanie Gutman and Women in the Military, Flirting with Disaster by Brian Mitchell, were bestsellers in the 1990s. We all know where we were and what we were doing on September 11th, 2001. I was now retired from the Navy and working in a building a block from the White House. As I walked home through Foggy Bottom and Georgetown and over the Key Bridge with thousands of others, I knew that we might be headed toward another war. During the post-9/11 wars, which followed, women served over 400,000 in-theater tours of duty. I say in-theater tours of duty instead of 400,000 women served because, as with the men, a lot of women served there 2, 3, 4, 5 times over the course of years. One of the first things we learned was that policies prohibiting women from ground combat occupations and from permanent assignment to ground combat units didn't keep them from ground combat. Or from being temporarily assigned or attached to ground combat units. There were no front lines in these wars, and combat conditions could suddenly erupt. Many troops, both men and women not in ground combat occupations, found themselves in ground combat. We needed women in our ground combat units, and necessity always tops policy. And over the years, women proved themselves in these units. When your convoy was attacked, you better know how to defend yourself and your comrades. When there was no male medic available to go out on patrol with an infantry unit, the available female medic went. When special operations forces or regular Army and Marine Corps infantry troops needed to communicate with or pat down local women, the men in the unit could not do it. So military women were often attached to these units. Thus, even though women were banned from assignment to ground combat units, they found themselves attached, as opposed to assigned, to infantry and special operations units, through local improvisations at the platoon, company, and battalion levels. The first such effort began around 2005 with the Lioness program, in which Army women accompanied Marine Corps infantry troops on raids where local women might be accounted. These women had little in the way of formal combat arms training and less in the way of protective gear such as body armor or helmets that fit over their ponytails. Later efforts, like female engagement teams and cultural support teams, saw women getting at least some training in combat arms before attaching to infantry and special operations units, including the Navy SEALs. But they still wore men's combat body armor. And it was until, I think, in 2017 that they finally got a helmet that would allow you to stick your ponytail out the back. And it's still a problem. And if you would think about it, what would happen if we put our male soldiers in body armor designed for women? There'd be hell to pay. And a number of women were badly wounded because because of the way the armor they couldn't bend. A lot of them developed hernias that eventually kept them from becoming mothers. And the Army even developed a new award, the Combat Action Badge, for them and their male colleagues who were ineligible to receive the Army Combat Infantryman Badge. So they were fighting along, both men and women who weren't in the infantry were fighting with infantrymen who got a reward. And the Army finally figured out we better have something to give to the rest of these guys. In the post-9/11 wars, 166 women were killed by enemy action. Another 1,115 of those who are still living received Purple Hearts. More than 9,000 women received the Army Combat Action Badge. 2 were prisoners of war, and 2 were awarded the Silver Star. Over the course of 20 years, we got better at preparing women for ground combat, though most of the time, but during most of the wartime, those occupations and units remained officially closed to them. That's why in January 2013, the Secretary of Defense abolished policies that kept women from entering ground combat occupations or to being assigned to units with ground combat missions. The Secretary of Defense opened these occupations and units in January of 2013, but women were not allowed to actually enter them until 2016. The Secretary ordered 3 years of deep study by each of the services and by Special Operations Command to establish and solidify gender-neutral occupational standards for each separate occupation. The order also allowed the service chiefs and the commander of Special Operations Command an opportunity to provide evidence that women should not serve in certain units or occupations. Although the Marine Corps did request a waiver to keep women from serving in infantry occupations, SecDef rejected that request, saying the Marine Corps failed to provide convincing support for their request. If you have questions on how that worked, I can ask a question and I'll tell you what the answer is. So here's the present. After 3 years of study, and the Army, once it was open to women, the Army conducted quarterly evaluations of ground combat unit readiness from 2019 to 2023 to make sure women weren't somehow scrambling up their ability to do their mission. And no evidence of degradation or readiness or combat cohesion was found in units with women in them. And here, as best we can piece together, are the number of women serving in each of these ground combat type things now. The Army numbers are from the end of calendar year 2024. And they were given to me by the woman who did that for the Army for her job. She was an Army colonel. Marine Corps is an estimate of 175 women in the infantry. No women have qualified as Navy SEALs as yet. And although most men who apply don't either, depending on the whatever number and standards are in effect, about 80% of the men who try to become SEALs fail. But women have qualified as what they call Special Warfare Combat Craft Crew, which are part of Special Forces. They drive the boats that get the SEALs ashore, and they're very small. Not the women, the boat. And for the Air Force, I don't have the numbers of women, the tactics offices in combat control and pararescue. Now, pararescue in the Air Force, in the Coast Guard rather, has been open to women all the time. And there have been women in the Coast Guard version of pararescue from the beginning. Not many, but some. So, women unofficially served in ground combat occupations for 10 years. 10 years before they were actually allowed into them, from about 2005 to the 2015-2016 timeframe. And then 10 years, they've been there for 10 years since they were open. And they have served effectively in just about all ground combat units, including Special Forces. And Special Forces, by the way, never objected to having women like the Marine Corps did, because they had been for years working with what they call enablers. These are language people or intelligence people or medical people who have always traveled with the SEALs or the other Special Forces, and they knew women could do it. So they never had any complaints at all. Provided you could meet the standards, you can get in. And you'll see that 175 Army women have already passed Ranger School, which is an extremely demanding school. Again, a lot of men can't pass it. And it involves, carrying people on your shoulders and stuff. It's a very difficult school, very rough. And the women do shave their heads when they enter because they're in a lot of messy places. And that's a 2024 number, so there are probably a few more who have gotten through Ranger School since then. All of this has happened in the past 20 years, but for some, women's merit and competency are not reasons for supporting their entry into ground combat roles, or maybe any combat roles. Our current Secretary of Defense, here it is. This is the book. In his 2024 best-selling book, The War on Warriors, Behind the Betrayal of the Men Who Keep Us Free, Pete Hegseth explains his reasons for considering women unfit for ground combat, while ignoring the need for and performance of women in the 9/11 wars. Despite the 1994 law that requires all military occupational standards to be gender neutral, he continually claims that standards are lowered for women to meet DEI quotas. And probably deliberately, maybe not, he conflates occupational standards with the separate basic physical fitness standards that every single active duty, reservist, and National or Air Guardsman must pass at least annually. These fitness standards vary by service and are graded by age and sex. However, as of last year, women in ground combat occupations have to meet the male fitness standards for their age. And it's not a problem for them. And despite 3 years of tests and studies conducted by DoD and the services before women entered formally into ground combat occupations, and 10 years of women's serving successfully in those occupations, SecDef in January 2026 ordered yet another study of women's fitness for ground combat. The study is being conducted by the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is here in Alexandria, and it's one of the many federally funded research and development centers like RAND and the Center for Naval Analysis. The study results are due in June. He has also ordered military women's history removed from DoD websites and training curricula, and has made it clear that women are, as the British might say, not a good look in visible leadership roles. And the mystery we are trying to figure out these days is, what leadership roles does he mean? Does he mean only things like the superintendent of the academy, or does he mean like platoon commanders, young captains? There's a lot of talk going on about that right now. Secretary Hegseth, as do many, leans heavily on ideological and cultural notions to back his claims that women should not be in combat. Chapter 5 of his book is entitled The Deadly Obsession with Women Warriors. In it, he writes that, do we want women to become killers? He's not alone. There are plenty of people that have that thought. He also says, as a compliment, I think, whenever the US has fought, there were women in combat zones. They faced the dangers, but instead of fighting, they carried the banners of safety, peace, and care. Women represent all that is good and pure in the world. I can't say that I'm an icon for that. And he has much, much more to say about military women in his book. In fact, I've read it not once but twice. And from what I've heard and read, it seems to me that he ought to have called it My War on Warrior Women. I'll be returning this book, by the way, to the Arlington Library, maybe as early as this afternoon.
The author?
What?
Author.
Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, wrote that. So should anyone want to check it out, it'll be back in the library soon. It's over at Shirlington. And that's my recap for today, and I'm open to any questions you may have.
Thank you.
Tom's there.
Carl, get you.
Lori, thank you so much for your talk. It's so interesting. As a captain, did you ever have men serving under you?
Oh yeah, all the time from my first day on my job, and I was a commanding officer out on the island of Diego Garcia, and I had 400 men and women who worked for me then. About 80% of them were men, sure, every day, and I worked for a lot of men too who were perfectly fine, no problems at all with them.
Also, I don't know if this applied to you when you were in the service, but did you have to grapple with the issue of transgender soldiers?
Not when I was still in, but as everybody here knows, transgender people have been serving in the military, having actually transitioned for about 15 years. And when the new administration came in, all of them, and there were I think about 1,500 of them, were gone very quickly. And some of them who were nearing retirement time never got their retirement. And they were, as far as nobody ever blamed a military failure on a transgender man or woman. So that's why women are leery right now, because he just got rid of them. Now there's a lot more women than there were transgender troops in the military, but it could still happen. Anything else?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Lori, it's been said that if the draft would have to be reinstated, that there would be many men that would be very unqualified, like it's a real high percentage number, and this is due to multiple factors. So if that were the case, would it be good to have women then subject to to register for selective service at least? I think I'm a proponent of it. I think women should be required to register for selective service, and because if, like I said before, if it was reinstated, if they had to have the draft, the number of unqualified males at this point, qualified women would have to make up the difference, I would think, or hope. Or so you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, now the selective service, it's a very interesting thing, and there has been a lot of studies and some lawsuits within the past 5 or 10 years on this issue. Everybody declared male at birth, keep that in mind, declared male at birth, who was an American citizen or a green card holder, must register for selective service at the age of 18 and keep themselves registered until they hit their 26th birthday. It's against the law for women to register. Women have tried, and it's against the law. And for men who don't register, there are some pretty heavy-duty punishments dealing with student loans, ability to take a federal job at some point, jail terms, fines of up to $250,000. I am of the opinion that either everybody should register or nobody should. And when I say all men, There are only 3 reasons that men don't have to register. One is that they're on active duty. The second is that they're incarcerated. And the third is that they're institutionalized for some physical or mental problem. And if you were serving on active duty and got out before you turned 26, you had to go register for the draft. So it's very inclusive. To bring back the draft, Congress would act. Congress would have to authorize it and could set the terms of who can and can't serve. But I will tell you, you don't have to put draftees in the infantry. That has been what has happened. They went into the Army infantry, which pretty much didn't have standards that had to be met until just 10 years ago. And you're right also, I think it's about 23% of young American men would actually meet at least the current qualifications for joining the military. Those qualifications change all the time. Do you or don't you need a high school diploma? Can we give you a waiver if you use thus and such a drug? So those have always been kind of changing. And think about how many women are in medical school now. It's probably at least 50%. We would certainly have to draft women doctors if we went back. So just the fact that women don't have to register for selective service doesn't mean we wouldn't draft them if we brought back the draft. So, and the reason they haven't been allowed to register is because it would take more, it would cost money for the local selective service boards to get more people and that sort of stuff. At least that's the answer they give when people ask. It would cost a couple of $1 million or a couple of $1 billion or maybe $1 trillion, I don't know.
Lori, thank you so much. I've just appreciated this conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've passed you in the hall and, I had our pleasant usual greeting and I said, I really would like to sit down and talk with Lori about just all of this. So
Well,
thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And then I'd like to just take a minute to personalize this talk. My nephew is a major in the Army Reserve based at Fort Des Moines in Des Moines, Iowa. And you will remember that the first casualties in this current war were from that unit. And one of them, the woman, Nicole, was not only over time, she and Philip worked very closely on major logistics projects and training events. And her funeral was yesterday. She was killed in Kuwait.
That's the downside of women in the military. And 3 have died in this current war so far. But it's no sadder than the men who are killed. It's a shame that anybody's killed in any war. Any more questions? Oh, okay, there are.
Hi, I'd like to know why you decided to go into the military, and what would you advise a young woman to do today? Choose a military career or not?
Okay, well, I graduated from college, and I had not an inkling in the world what I wanted to do. So I went home, and I'd been home about 3 weeks. It was early July, and one Saturday morning, my father knocked on my bedroom door and said, "Get a job." Well, I didn't want to teach. I wanted to get out of New Jersey. I didn't want to go to Katie Gibbs and become a secretary. And remember, this is the late 60s, so it wasn't that easy to find something for me that I wanted to do. But the Vietnam War was going on. And I thought, well, I can get out of New Jersey if I join the Air Force. And I went down to the local post office and talked to the Air Force recruiter, and he said to me, I haven't got an inkling what women do in the Air Force. But just then, the Navy, the sailor walked by, and he said, well, I don't know what they do in the Navy, but we have a woman recruiter in New York City. I'll make you an appointment, okay? And I said, great. And I took the train into New York, and she showed me her scrapbook of her as a young woman officer in Hawaii. It looked wonderful. And it turns out that was my first duty station. I was at Pearl Harbor. And so I applied, and three months later, I was on my way to officer candidate school in Newport. And I figured, well, it's only a two-year sign up, so I can get out in 2 years, and maybe by that time I'll know what I really wanted to do. But I liked it. I loved the travel. I loved the opportunity to do things that didn't involve teaching kids. Not that I like kids, but I had 4 little brothers, and I'd spent a lot of time teaching them. And so it suited me, and so I stayed and got out about 25 years later. And you asked about what today. I would certainly say, there are a lot of women who join, particularly for the educational benefits, the GI Bill, and there are other ways. Some of them seem to be lessening these days. That used to be a good way to get put through graduate school if that was your aim, and in the military sometimes even sent people to law school or medical school. So it was a good way to get an education. It's an awfully good way to learn how to be a boss. As I said, from the time I entered into the Navy, I had people working for me, and I had to wrestle with budgets, with keeping equipment running, facilities like this place. I had some nice talks with Andrew sometimes, because I kind of got into what you have to do to keep a place like this running, except it wasn't a home for people like us. It was Navy communications equipment and satellites and ships and that sort of thing. So you learn how to be a manager and a leader at a very young age. Same for young enlisted people. They learn how to have people working for them. And you don't get to pick the people that are working. You get whoever comes through the door, and you have to find a way to make them part of their team, to figure out what they're good at, and to bring them along and make sure you're getting the best use of their talents. Sometimes I wonder if Peter Hegseth is too young to have watched World War II movies when he was growing up. How do all of them start? They start, in those movies, it's all white guys, but there's the smart aleck from Brooklyn, there's the naive guy from Kansas Farm, there's the Harvard smart ass, there's the party boy, there's one of every kind of guy that you can think of. And the job of the sergeant and the young officer, who the sergeant is also trying to bring up, is to make them into a cohesive team. Diversity, whether it's just all white men or everybody, is basic to the military. It's basic to living. I mean, any two of us are diverse in ways. So you learn how to build a team from a diverse group of people. It's not that we're all one, it's that from many we make one, e pluribus unum. And that is one of the things I think that Peter Hegseth needs to start to understand. Your job isn't to start with a coherent group. It's to make a coherent group from a group of diverse people by getting to know them and their talents.
How extensive is sexual harassment, and is it getting any better over the years?
It's pretty much as extensive as it ever was. It's not strictly a military problem, but we can do a lot more about it than the general population. It's a problem for women. I mean, I was taught from the time I was a kid, don't get a reputation. Don't go into bars by yourself. Not that I was doing that at age 9, but one of my brothers used to sell his Boy Scout Christmas tree stuff. Women are taught from the time they're very young to watch out, to be a little bit careful. And most of the sexual assaults in the military involve alcohol abuse, and but not all of them. And another thing that people don't realize is that because the military is about 80% male and 20% women, there are more male victims of sexual assault or harassment in the military than women. And the male sexual assault is not gay men raping. It's hazing. It's hazing with broomsticks. I'll say, and other things. But it's a big problem. It's not talked about much, but there are an awful lot of men who have been sexually harassed while being hazed for not carrying their workload or whatever in the military. The statistics haven't changed that much over time. What has changed is we know how to take better care of the people who have been assaulted, how to get them help, how to, and when it's a really bad thing, how to get them veterans benefits for the PTSD and that sort of thing. But I don't think they've made much, despite all kinds of studies and new policies, they're pretty much the same. A couple of thousand a year. Most women are not sexually assaulted in the military. They may be harassed. Most women I know have been harassed at some point in time. And the military is also starting now to get more serious about harassment of anybody. So it's still a problem. It's still a societal problem with, I guess, in the whole world. So, but the response to them is better. Not perfect, but better.
I have a comment about sexual assault in the military. I'm Judy Hijikata. My son just retired as a Marine Corps JAG, and what he spent the last 5 years doing is working in a relatively new branch of the JAG Corps. So when you have people who are get to the point where they're going to trial against their alleged abuser, there's always been a prosecutor and a defense person. And now, I think maybe for the last 10 years or so, there's been an Office of Victims Legal Counsel whose job is to help the victim through the court process. And also to do things like work on their veterans' benefits. So that is one step that the military has taken. I don't, of course, know what's going to happen under Mr. Hegseth's leadership for those JAGs. The other thing I just wanted to say was when you mentioned transgender folks being kicked out of the military, there is an effort that is working with the people. You know, some people left, but some people wanted to stay. And there is an effort helping those people through their, I forget what the term is, you know, the process that they go through to try to prove that they should be able to stay. And if anybody's interested in that, I think the organization is called the Institute for Military Justice. It's what's called a private nonprofit.
Thanks for bringing both those things up. And yes, it's true, there are now lawyers for the women who were often, not the women, for anybody who was a sexual assault, to help them from being really harassed during the discovery. In the military, they have something like a pre-trial thing where you would call it a grand jury in the civilian life, but it's something similar to that. And about 10 years ago, there was a Naval Academy woman who had been raped by a particular guy several times, and the court-martial for that guy, and first the discovery before the court-martial, was held over at the Navy Yard. And his lawyers kept that poor young woman going for 2 days straight, asking her about every sexual encounter she'd ever had. You know, what did she wear? And after that, the reforms were made. And thank your son for doing that.
Laurie, this has been an amazing, wonderful, informative hour with you. It's We know you're continuing to do the work in other boards. Good luck. I think one day we'll get rid of that man, and we're glad that you're here right now. Thank you very much.
Okay. And thank all of you for coming. It was good to see all of you here.